We've done river cruising in the Far East and Egypt, but this was our first time in Europe. We started the trip on Scenic Crystal because Scenic Sapphire that we should have been on was trapped at the wrong side of a broken lock in Hungary. The ships are just like modern hotels, with a swish reception area. Off that is the lounge, where there are talks, demonstrations, music and a free bar. You could also get snacks if the 3 generous meals a day didn't fill you up. These meals were in the dining room. Self-service for breakfast and lunch, and waiter service for dinner. We met the chef who showed us round his tiny but spotless kitchen. Then it was off to bed. The skyline of Amsterdam was the view from our balcony the next morning. All tours were included, so after breakfast we were taken to a local cheese factory where we were shown how it's made.
And then we can start cutting the milk with 3 special knives like this. We make our only gouda cheese, good at gouda, we say gouda.
There was plenty of cheese on show, as well as dolls in traditional costume. Although they only make Gouda, they do it in dozens of different types, different ages, different additives, and from the milk of different animals. There were plenty of samples as well, and we were shown the strange habit of eating it with mustard. From here we went to Zanzerschans, where windmills from all over Holland have been brought together. The cat mill combines the base of an oil mill with the top and machinery of a dye and pigment mill. The place isn't just a museum. People still live and work here. There's a factory where wooden clogs are made. They start off as blocks of wood like this. We were shown the old-fashioned tools, and then the so-called modern machinery that replaced them. Clogs were originally used for working in, but nowadays they're very expensive souvenirs. After lunch we started the cruise proper, heading upstream along the Rhine, and soon came to the first of dozens of locks we were going to go through during the next fortnight. After sailing all night, we got to Dusseldorf in Germany the following morning. First we saw the quirky buildings and weird artwork of Germany's equivalent of Media City. Then we went to Rhine Promenade for a walking tour around the old town, starting at St. Lambert's Church with its twisted spire, which was built in the Middle Ages. It's the Catholic Basilica, and these sculptures are on the wall at the back. Opposite the church there's a courtyard with houses originally built for fishermen and bakers. The alleyway leads to the river Dussel, where there's a group of sculptures showing the history of Dusseldorf. Just round the corner is a bakery with lots of the different breads that the area is famous for. Then we went to the marketplace with its 16th century old city hall and the equestrian statue of Johann Wilhelm II, the late 17th century Duke of Bavaria, amongst many other titles. Just down the road is the House of Bells, which ring on the hour. We walked on, dodging the trams, until we came to the food market. In the next street is a famous mustard shop. There were loads of different mustards, and we could try them all. Oof, she didn't seem to like that. And I wasn't so sure about this one either. Here the guide left us to wander on our own. Then it was downhill all the way to the river. There's a lovely walk along the Rhine promenade, and we passed outdoor cafes and tour boats until we got back to the castle tower. It's a worldwide disease, this, isn't it? We went back to the ship to change for an evening out at the medieval castle of Marksburg, where we had a private guided tour. It's the only castle in the Middle Rhine to have escaped both destruction and well-meaning restoration. Its history covers almost 500 years, and the oldest section dates from around 1200. It's in a superb defensive position, sitting high above the Rhine, with views in every direction. It was completely self-contained and had its own forge and winery. It had big kitchens, and this butcher's block had really seen some service. In those days, you kept your valuables at the side of the bed. The place even had its own chapel. They also did their own weaving. In one of the rooms there's a display of old armour. The evening ended with the medieval banquet. The ship sailed on overnight, and when we woke next morning we were just passing Boppard and entering the Rhine gorge. This is a 40-mile stretch of the river which became a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2002. The river narrows here with rugged hillsides on both banks, many of them with a ruined fortress on top, and a tiny village with half-timbered houses at the bottom. On a narrow bend, the Lorelei Rock towers 430 feet above the river. The dangerous currents here gave rise to the legend in which a beautiful girl's seductive song lured mariners to their doom on the rocks at the foot of the cliff. Some of the vineyards look almost impossibly steep. A railway line runs down each side of the river. We were surprised at the amount of commercial shipping there was on the river. 200 vessels a day through this stretch alone. We passed the Niederwald monument, built from 32 tons of bronze to commemorate Germany's formation in 1871. The gorge ends at Rudesheim. It's quite a small town and easy to explore on foot, but is a very popular tourist destination, and its narrow streets and alleyways have lots of bars, restaurants and souvenir shops. One of its more unusual attractions is the 16th century Brommershof, which houses Siegfried's Museum of Mechanical Musical Instruments, most of which are still in working order. Old phonographs played wax cylinders or 78s and needed the needles changing after every tune. The rarest instrument plays real violins. The musical boxes are still made on the premises. This is the largest doll automaton Calliope that was ever built. A short walk along the Drosselgasse brought us to the cable car. These two-seater cars took us over the village and across the Rheingau vineyards, one of the most prestigious wine-producing areas in Germany. Near to the top station is the Niederwald monument, which we'd seen from the river. From the rotunda on top, we looked down onto the Rhine just downstream of its junction with the mine. Whilst we were in Rudesheim, our bags were transferred to Scenic Sapphire, which had finally escaped from the lock, and we joined her to continue up the mine. This stretch of the mine is famous for glass blowing, so we had a demonstration on board.
I made a baby point already. Now I'm going to stretch one out. There's a stretch of 28 kilometers on the river here. Every single shop is involved in the glass industry. Flare, flare, flare. You want to hit the proportional correct thing and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And now don't try this at home. I'm going to cut the glass with some scissors. I used to do this a lot at the Christmas market at the very beginning.
By the end of the demonstration, we'd arrived in Miltenberg and set off on a walking tour around one of the prettiest and best preserved medieval cities on the River Main. There were lots of archways under the old buildings. The Gothic church of St James had its twin towers added about 1830. This whole area of Germany is renowned for its snowballs. You can just see the white Miltenberg castle at the end of the street. The Giant's Inn, built about 1500, is one of Germany's oldest taverns. The inn sign includes the six-pointed Brewer's Star. The old bridge was destroyed in World War II and rebuilt in 1950. We went on a village life tour to an old water-driven forge, which impressed the men and bored the women. After that, we had a big barbecue in a winery. That pleased everyone. The next morning started just a little bit blearily as we docked in Wurzburg, opposite the Marienburg fortress and the Baroque Kapelle. We went down the romantic road to Rothenburg and started with a walking tour of the old walled town, one of the prettiest and best preserved medieval towns in Germany. Next to this guest house is one of the most photographed sites in the country. This is the medieval crime museum. Germany is famous for its sausages, so we stopped to look at the display in this butcher's shop. Then everyone got a tray of assorted bangers, complete with mustard. The City Hall, which is Gothic at the back and Renaissance at the front, dominates the market square. There's a Steiff bear shop in the square. From here we wandered around on our own, finding more pretty streets and a square with a food festival going on. Not that there were many takers in the rain. The bus was advertising Kath Wolfhart's Christmas shop. At the end of the street is Castlegate, with its strange carving. This leads to the castle gardens. The gardens are on a promontory with views over the town and surrounding valley. When we got back to the ship, we found the stewardess had done strange things with the towel. Overnight we sailed to Bamberg on the river Regnitz, just where it joins the Main. The old city hall was built in 2 stages. The half-timbered section was finished around 1440, and the rest built in 1668. The ornate Baroque bits and the frescoes were added about 100 years later. According to legend, it was built in the air. In other words, on a bridge, because the bishop who owned the land wouldn't let the city have any to build it on. This very attractive brewery is where they make the distinctive smoked beer. Recognise this sign? On a hill above the town is the area called Domplatz, where the cathedral is. An arch next to the cathedral leads to the old palace. The region was ruled by bishops from the middle of the 13th century, and this was their residence in the 16th and 17th centuries. After that, they moved to the new residence just across the road. The floor of the entrance arch is made of wooden blocks to silence the horses' hooves. Through the arch is the rose garden. From the garden you can see down into the main shopping area, which is squeezed between the Regnitz and the Rhine-Main-Danube canal. The old houses in Little Venice were originally built for fishermen. We had plenty of time to explore on our own in this very beautiful place. We had a last look back at the Abbey and then cruised up the canal to Nuremberg. Although most people have only heard of the post-war trials, it's actually an attractive medieval city. We went into the old town on a footbridge over the moat, through an arch and into a courtyard. Then through another arch, where we saw one of the 80 medieval defensive towers. Eventually we got to the castle courtyard with half-timbered buildings and the stone church tower. From here we looked down over the city. Next we went down a zigzag path going back through the defences into the town. The half-timbered buildings were stone at the bottom to reduce fire risk. One of them had a statue of St. George and the Dragon. We stopped at a bakery to taste the local gingerbread. Then we passed St. Sebald's Church with its ornate statues. Opposite the front of the church is the old town hall, with a prison underneath. It was a short walk then down to the market square, where there's a 55-foot filigree fountain built in 1390 and replaced about 100 years ago. There's a more modern fountain in the shopping centre, where we went into an historic restaurant for samples of beer and sausages. The restaurant spans the River Pegnitz. We went into the market, where some of the stalls were selling cute little animals made of straw. Then we listened to the buskers. That night we went through a lock at the summit of the canal at 1,332 feet, the highest point on earth that could be reached by ships from the sea. Through the night and into the next morning we sailed on the Rhine-Main-Danube Canal. This 106-mile canal linking the Main to the Danube was the final step in connecting the North Sea with the Black Sea and was completed in 1992. The canal can take ships up to 190 metres long and almost 11.5 metres wide. There's a total of 16 locks on this section. Passing the Liberation Hall at Kelheim, we pulled into the bank and got off to go by coach to Regensburg on the River Danube. At this point, the Danube isn't navigable. The entrance to the old town is over the historic bridge, which we couldn't film because it was being renovated, and then past the bridge tower. Inside the city there are no less than 1,300 listed buildings of every imaginable European architectural style. These include the Old Town Hall and Market Square. The whole Old Town is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The Cathedral of St. Peter could be one of the finest Gothic buildings in Bavaria. Most of it was built between 1250 and 1275, but the two 340-foot spires weren't added until 1869. Down a narrow alley from the cathedral is a small church where we had an organ recital. Then we walked down to the old port to wait for the ship to take us downstream on the Danube proper. Next day we went on a trip to Cesky Krumlov in the Czech Republic. The way in is through this amazing arch beneath the castle. Then we went over a bridge across the Vltava River, which almost completely surrounds the old town. The castle continues along the ridge overlooking the river and the town. We wandered along the narrow, winding streets between colourful old buildings, many of which have souvenir shops on the ground floor. The streets went upwards past more painted buildings and crazy drain pipes until they came out in the main square. Ooh. There were lovely views from up here. We went back down and across the river onto the road to the castle. This was lined with more tourist shops, little alleyways, and a baker making the traditional spit roast chimney cakes. The arch leads to the castle courtyard. Then a bridge went over a bear pit. In the inner courtyard is the castle museum. We went through another series of courtyards till we came out onto the balcony on top of the city entrance arch. The view of the town from here was amazing. Going back down to the bridge, we realised that a lot of the fancy stonework was really render that had had the pattern scraped out in a technique called sgraffiti. Then the coach took us to Linz in Austria, where the ship was waiting just across the river from this fantastic illuminated building. Overnight we sailed to the Melk jetty, where we moored next to the Lord Byron. A coach took us to the abbey, which stands high above the town. We started in the gardens with the strange cut-out animals. There's a pavilion with a grand piano and beautiful frescoes. The Italian-style Baroque abbey dates from the first half of the 18th century. The guided tour started in the courtyard. It's not only an active Benedictine monastery, but also a secondary and preparatory school with nearly 900 students of both sexes. We went through a series of rooms with completely over-the-top decoration. The far end of the abbey had a viewing point over the river. We walked through the church, where we couldn't film because there was a service on, then down the spiral staircase to the cloisters. Back on the Danube, the more energetic passengers borrowed the ship's bikes to cycle to Dürnstein. I hope they got as good views as we did as we sailed down the Wachau valley, passing ruined castles and pretty little villages. As we passed Weissenkirchen, which is the centre of the local wine-growing area, we had a sampling session on board. That's something the cyclists missed out on. There's not a lot left of Castle Dürnstein just outside this lovely village. Because of the strong current, we had to pass the village, turn round, then moor alongside the Amacerto before we could get off and walk back along the riverside path. A little tunnel leads into the village centre. Richard the Lionheart was imprisoned here for a year in 1192. We just wandered around the pretty narrow streets. Back on the riverbank, we could see just how fast the current was. We sailed again overnight, and the following morning we were in Vienna, capital of Austria. After an orientation tour, we left the bus by the Fine Arts Museum. We walked across the park through the arch to the massive Hofburg Palace. It was built as the winter palace for the mighty Habsburg dynasty and has been the Austrian seat of government since 1279. Lots of new wings have been added since, so it now contains the President's residence, several museums, the Treasury, National Library and the Spanish Riding School. Through the archway is a square with horse-drawn carriages for hire, and St. Michael's Church. The Pestzoll fountain on the Graben commemorates the Great Plague. St. Stephen's Cathedral is at the end of the Graben, and opposite is the complete contrast of the Haas House, a shop and restaurant complex built in 1990. Let loose on our own, we went down the shopping streets till we came to the Opera House. Outside, a busker was posing for photographs. As we went back to the Haas House to meet the guide, we watched an impromptu cycle rickshaw ballet. We went back to the ship to get ready to go to the Palais Liechtenstein for a champagne reception and a classical music concert. We stayed overnight in Vienna and the following day went to Bratislava, capital of Slovakia since the dissolution of Czechoslovakia in 1993. Graffiti artists are allowed to paint on the retaining wall for the motorway. We went through the walls and past the statue of the Immaculata. In front of St. Martin's Cathedral is the Holocaust Monument, commemorating the death of 60,000 Slovakian Jews in World War II. It stands on the site of the former synagogue. The hop-on, hop-off bus is unusually small. The cathedral was the coronation church of the rulers of Hungary. Crowns in the cobbled street show the coronation route. We walked down narrow streets into the middle of the old town, passing a statue of a peeping Tom who used to spy on his neighbours. St. Michael's Gate is part of the old defences built in the 17th century over a moat. Now we know why the buses are so small. Down a side street is the Ursuline Church, Rococo buildings and the old Franciscan monastery. Back on the main street we followed the bus to where bronze plates in the pavements show mock lip prints of movie stars. The street opens out into the Frankistanska Square, where there's a colourful bear and a fountain of a woman with a vase. Behind this is the oldest shop in Bratislava, where there's a museum of cash registers. Just outside is the craft market. Near the craft market is a small courtyard where we saw the Primate's Palace, built in the 1770s for the local archbishop. It's open to the public and there's a statue of St. George and the Dragon in the inner courtyard. At the top end of the courtyard is the old City Hall with its fancy tiled roof. And at the other side is the modern City Hall. We went through an arch into a small square and looked back at the other side of the old City Hall. In the middle of the main square is the Roland Fountain. It was commissioned by Emperor Maximilian II, who was the first king of Hungary to be crowned in Bratislava. A lot of the buildings around the square are embassies. There are plenty of cafes to relax with a coffee and a very naughty cream cake. As we left the old town, we passed the National Theatre, built in the 1880s, and outside it there was an acrobatic busker. Then we walked past more restaurants, through a little park, and back to the bus, which took us back to Vienna. We moved on again overnight, and early in the morning we were sailing down a beautiful stretch of the Danube. We tied up alongside another ship in the middle of Budapest, capital of Hungary, right opposite the beautiful Parliament building. There are other attractive buildings on our side of the river as well, including St. Anne's Church. The city is split in two by the Danube, with us moored in Buda and the Parliament in Pest. Today's tour began on Castle Hill in Buda. In a little park on a street where the houses are 300 to 400 years old is the monument to the 1849 heroes. A bit further along the street is the Matthias Church. The foundation stone was laid in the mid-13th century when it was called the Church of Our Lady, and it was built for the German population living nearby. The roof tiles are made of majolica. Just behind the church is a statue of St. Stephen. Behind him is the Fisherman's Bastion. This magical structure was not intended for defence, but was built during restoration of the old walls to celebrate the city's 1000th anniversary in 1896. It's named after the Guild of Fishermen, who used to hold their fish market nearby. From the bastion we had good views of the Danube. Trinity Square is in front of the church, and the column was erected by survivors of a plague about 300 years ago. Walking back, we passed more old buildings, a fountain, and a shop where Princess Diana once bought a scarf. We saw the back of the palace as we went down the river to cross to Pest. We stopped to take a picture of the front of the palace and then passed the Opera House before arriving in Heroes Square, which was laid out as part of Hungary's 1000th anniversary celebrations. The statue at the top of the column is of Archangel Gabriel, and those round it are famous national heroes. The Museum of Fine Arts is on one side of the square. The City Park ice rink just next to the square is used in summer for boating and exhibitions, and here we saw this concept Mercedes. Then we went to a concert by a professor of music. The second half of the concert was a piano recital. We spent the rest of the day relaxing on board, watching the river traffic. The Parliament looked beautiful during the day, but at night it looked magnificent as we went for a floodlit cruise as a finale to our journey.